All advice given is for general information purposes. All legal cases are different, and you should seek the advice of your own attorney before acting or making decisions. No attorney-client privilege applies to communications on this show, and no attorney-client relationship is created by calling or writing in. Attorney Rominger practices only in Pennsylvania and maintains his primary office in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.
Hey, good afternoon, guys. 540-0580, Carl Rominger here on WHP 580 and, of course, WLAN 1390. And I've brought a special guest on today. I have Dr. Arnold T. Shienvold. And, Doctor, you with me?
I'm here.
Your practice, and so people who don't know you are a Ph.D. in
clinical psychology.
Clinical psychology.
Right.
But your specialization these days is quite a bit in the realm of family conflict and custody issues. Is that correct?
That is correct. General forensic, but especially in family conflict, custody evaluation work, anything to do with dysfunctions within the family. And
I will disclose I've had the pleasure of working with you in at least a few cases. I'm aware of your work and a lot of others, particularly in the central Pennsylvania area. How far does your practice extend?
Oh, in Pennsylvania, I have cases from Allentown up to Wellsboro, out to Chambersburg. I've had cases in Maryland and West Virginia and over towards Philadelphia. So it's a pretty wide area.
Yeah, that is a pretty wide area. And I imagine you see all different kinds of situations, both in and out of court.
I do.
Today, I want to focus just a little bit about a little bit of everything you do, but talk about the custody evaluation process, because that, for a lot of our listeners, we get a lot of phone calls about people who are engaged in custody battles. Mm-hmm. And notice I use the word battle instead of case. I guess it depends on the mindset. We have a lot of people that have high conflict cases. We have other people who have lower conflict cases. I guess from a lawyer's standpoint, this is what we tell clients, and I'll tell you, I would say to a client quite frequently, I think you need to get a custody evaluator. You need to get an evaluation done because a judge is just going to meet with your child for 15 minutes, if you're lucky, talk to the child for a few minutes, and then try to get some input from a few hours of listening to the two parents argue over who's a better parent and somehow come up with a comprehensive custody plan. And I don't think a judge can do it in a hearing the same way that you can. So can you kind of help us out and tell us what it is you do to assist a court?
If we remember that in any of these cases, we're trying to figure out what's going to be in the best interests of the child. I mean, the standard in Pennsylvania and now nationwide is a best interest standard. When we talk about a custody evaluation by a psychologist, we're talking about what are the psychological best interests of the child with respect to the relative parenting arrangements that can be put into place to his or her benefit. So the custody evaluator is attempting to gather as much information as they can through evaluative techniques and actually through investigative techniques as well to be able to answer that question or to make a recommendation to the court with respect to options as to what are the best answers to that question. And what you said is actually very consistent with what I talk with people about, and you can answer this part better than I, but if you get a full-day hearing in a custody case, which may be the exception versus the rule given how busy our courts are,
right?
That's probably about 6 hours of actual court time.
Yeah, I would think that's about correct. In an 8-hour day with the type of breaks and also just the physical limitations, people sometimes think that the court should go all day, but because of the requirement of a stenographic record, for instance, the stenographer simply cannot continue to type all afternoon.
Right. In a custody evaluation, in a comprehensive custody evaluation like one that might be done here, one that I might do, we're putting in close to 40 hours of time with the family, which, if you compare that to a 6-hour day, is more like a 7-day trial.
Right.
And although there are certainly parts of the country where you get 7-day trials, you don't hear of it very often around here. So we can get a lot more information and then, in a sense, serve as a liaison to the judge with that information. And so it allows both attorneys to get much more of the information that's pertinent to the decision-making to the judge.
And actually, I can give you kind of interesting little legal quirk here, which is the rules of evidence say that I have to authenticate a lot of evidence that I bring to court. Hearsay is generally not admissible.
Right.
And so in order to effectively present a lot of information to a court in a child custody case, either both sides have to stipulate to the admissibility of the matters, or you can call an expert witness like yourself, a doctor, and custody evaluator, and then you're allowed under the rules of evidence as an expert witness to testify about things that aren't generally otherwise admissible but relevant in your inquiry.
Correct.
And so that's the other, I think, as a lawyer, the advantage we see sometimes in bringing someone like you onto a case is we can now bring in material that would have been very difficult to admit otherwise without agreement from the other side, or just prohibitive time-wise again. And just like you say, the court's not going to give me 3 days to drag in all different people to authenticate documents and to avoid hearsay.
Right, and that's really true. And there's obviously, like everything, there's a good and a bad side to that. When I'm allowed to report on what someone else has said to me, I'm allowed to report on it because I've relied on it in my report, but I'm not testifying to its veracity, to whether or not it's true. I'm just saying this is what I've heard and relied on it in my report. Now, obviously the judge can make that difference. I would agree that in some cases that's kind of a side door to get some hearsay testimony in. But I think for the most part it's done legitimately to really help the court get more information.
And I can tell you, that's the other thing I've told people, when you do have an adverse report, sometimes when people get a custody evaluator involved like yourself, we get a situation where we're not happy with the result. The client looks at you and goes, well, he's not recommending that I get primary custody. He thinks it should be split custody, and I don't understand. And the only avenue of attack I usually tell people is, you can still have the full hearing, but great weight is usually going to be given to the expert's report. But that's exactly what you attack is, okay, well, let's look at what he relied on and what statements he took from people that we could prove are untrue, because some of your investigation isn't always to verify everything you're told.
Exactly. That's true.
And so that would be the best way, I would think, to attack it. But unfortunately, that is often not the case because I think generally, again, because of the length of time and the fact that I don't want to get back into this a little bit in the next segment here, the actual process of doing the evaluation, but because of the back and forth you do where you talk to some people and then bring them back in and go back and forth and gather information, it kind of self-verifies itself as it goes.
Well, a custody expert, a custody evaluator, has an obligation to get as much corroborating evidence or corroborating data as they possibly can. So what you're trying to do is get these different sources to give you data that converges on some sense of what the true data is. And every evaluation is going to have some data that disagrees with other data. You have neighbors who say the couple fought all the time, and then you might have a neighbor who says, well, I never saw them fight. But if you have 5 neighbors who are saying they fight all the time and one neighbor who says they didn't fight, then you have enough convergence of data. Then if you have psychological testing that says someone has an anger problem, and if you have, the children who you're interviewing saying, gosh, I hated when mom and dad fought, now you have a series of converging data that really helps you get a true picture of what's going on. And that's what's used in terms of assessing factors, and I guess we can talk about factors for custody in Pennsylvania now, but factors that are pertinent for the court in terms of making their decisions.
And those what do I want to say? Those concepts, like for instance, when 5 people say something, one person doesn't. It's kind of always the joke I've always said that if one person tells me it's going to rain, we don't know if it's going to rain. But if you hear it from 10 people, it's probably going to rain, or at least that's what the weather's reporting.
And the 11th comes in drenched, then you're
right, and then you're sure of it.
Right.
I'm going to take a break here. We're going to go to commercial for a few minutes, but I know, Dr. Shienvold, you've said you're willing to talk to callers and answer some questions for folks. So the talk line number is 540-0580. Guys, this is your chance if you want to talk to an expert psychologist and maybe, kind of run something by in your own custody situation or how you feel, or maybe tell us a war story of an evaluation, or you always wondered why somebody said what they said or why they would do what they did in a custody evaluation. This is your chance. So 540-0580. We'll see you guys after the break. Welcome back. Carl Rominger here. I'm with Dr. Arnold Shienvold with Riegler, Shienvold & Associates out of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. They have a comprehensive psychological practice, but Dr. Shienvold is here talking about custody and custody evaluations with me today. 540-0580 if you want to get in on the conversation again. You guys know the number, 540-0580. This is your chance to throw some custody questions at us if you're up for it. Doctor, when we took the break, we talked a little bit about just some general precepts. Tell me the process. I mean, how do you get involved in a case and what happens?
Generally, a case comes one of two ways. It's referred from the court, either through the conciliation process or from the judge themselves. And there has been a request for an independent, neutral examination or evaluation of the custodial issues. That's actually the best way to get a referral. You could certainly have the parties stipulate to getting a custody evaluation. They've gotten together with their attorneys, and with the advice of their attorneys, have decided that a custody evaluation might help in the overall settlement process because there are certain questions that need to be answered, and perhaps if there was some reassurance around some issues or some clarification of issues that are causing some of the impasses and the conflict over parenting, if they had those answers from the evaluation, they may be able to settle the case. So that's another way it comes. In the past, it was not infrequent to have two experts involved, one who got hired by one side and one by the other side.
Right.
That's very much gone out of favor because you get what's called dueling experts who kind of neutralize each other, and it's a difficult way to do a neutral evaluation. So that's becoming less and less common. The more common process is to settle upon a single expert who really is not advocating for either side, but simply trying to determine what's going to be in the best interest of the child. So that's the way the referral is likely to come in within that mode. Once the referral comes in, then different evaluators use different processes. If you're a psychologist, you're going to have to follow the guidelines of the American Psychological Association for child custody studies or child custody evaluations. And generally that means what you can expect, and I won't put numbers on this, but you can expect that all of the parental figures are going to have extensive interviews, comprehensive interviews. And I say parental figures because it probably will include step-parents or significant others in that process to get a full picture. You're going to have interviews of the children if they're of an age that you can have a conversation with them. Generally, kids from 4 years up can be interviewed. Children younger than 4 can be seen, though, and observed and interacted with in some way. There'll be some observations made of the children with their parents, and that will be done and should be done to assess kind of the interaction skills and parenting skills that you see in them together, what their attachments are like, what the comfort is with the interactions. There will be the collection of collateral information. That could be doctor's reports, it could be hospital reports, it could be counseling reports, children and youth investigations, police information. Each case offers a different set of collaterals who might be important. It could be conversations with teachers or guidance counselors. It could be neighbors' input and information.
Does the court ever give you collateral information directly, like where a judge might write you a letter and say, here's my observations, or is that pretty rare?
The judge almost never gives you observations. I would say that's very rare, because it would be considered, first of all, the judge would be considering the case ahead of time, and it would be considered kind of ex parte, one-sided conversations with a judge. The judge would never have a conversation without both attorneys on the line. And quite honestly, one would have to wonder if the information is presented in some unusual way, there'd be questions about the judge's possible bias in the case before he's heard all the evidence. So I would say that's virtually never going to happen. The only time that could possibly occur is, let's say there was an instance of domestic violence that occurred in the middle of a custody evaluation.
Okay.
You might then get a call and say, this is what's occurred. Could you also now, as part of your evaluation, assess dangerousness, impact on the child, whatever it may be?
Okay, interesting.
So I tried to give you kind of the breadth of information that we're trying to take in when we do this. Then there's a component of psychological testing. Obviously, if this is being done by a non-psychologist, you're going to see less psychological testing.
Right.
If it's being done by a psychologist, you'll probably see more.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Almost all psychologists who are doing, and I say almost all because there have been surveys, there's national surveys on this, probably 85% of the people doing these use the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory, the MMPI-2, which is a pretty broad-based, what's called objective personality inventory, which helps screen for certain degrees of psychopathology and personality dynamics that might be going on in a case. Beyond that, there's a whole bunch of other psychological tests that might be used, but different people will use them differently.
Now, the criticism that I hear, and I don't mean it as a real criticism, but I'll hear people say, well, what psychologists really, there's nothing to that. They can't really figure out what's going on, and they really can't understand why somebody does what they do. And in my personal experience, it doesn't seem to be true. I would assume you would be similarly the same mind, basically, that you guys have some ability to do that.
Yeah, or else I'd be a charlatan. If I sat here and said, we have no ability to do
right,
that,
we have no ability.
I'm doing it every day.
Right, and I think that's why when we look at those reports, again, from the lawyer's standpoint, I've seen the reports, the inventories of people's personality, but I'm always most interested in what your direct observations and demeanor of the person are and what you think it means in relationship to the case.
If you think of this whole process as hypothesis testing, almost like a scientific experiment.
Right.
So some hypothesis is raised. Mom is trying to block the kids from seeing dad, or that's one hypothesis. Or dad has never been involved in the kids' lives and doesn't understand their personalities, or something like that, or their styles. You then test that hypothesis by gathering as much data as you can. So if you do direct observations and dad doesn't know that his son is really interested in baseball and never talks to him about it, let's say. Or let's say that you get psychological testing that implies that this person has very little insight and is not very empathetic. And then you have neighbors who say they have never seen dad outside kicking a soccer ball with a kid, and the soccer coach who says, well, dad might come for the last 5 minutes of the soccer game.
Right.
That's what I mean by the convergence of data. So whereas no one piece of that data is saying much about dad, because if I have a psychological test that says dad has little insight, but then I talk to dad, and he shows tremendous insight in the child, and he's been at every soccer game, and he is kicking the ball around with his kids, and all the kids love to jump on him and play and have a great time, then the psych testing is the outlier, and the other information is where the convergence is. So I've tested the hypothesis and gone the other way with it. That's what you're doing across the board with the various factors. Who's most likely to encourage contact between the child and the other parent. Mm-hmm. That's one of the major factors we have to look for in custody evaluation work. Well, again, using the same hypotheses testing technique, you'd say mom either is or is not encouraging, and you look for the data that either supports that or not. And the same you would do for dad.
And yeah, and I can tell you, just come back to that fostering the other parent's relationship with the child, I find that to be a difficult concept sometimes for some of my parents to understand. Others seem to understand. I've said it this way. I've said that a third of the people in divorces never even talk to me about custody. I'll say, do you guys have kids? Yeah, we have kids, but we've worked it all out. And they don't seem to have any difficulty figuring out a custody scheme that's going to work amongst the family. A third of them seem to need somebody to give them a little bit of a kick, and then another third seem to be in that high conflict area where they need an order, and then they need to be told how to follow the order again and again and again. But
actually, nationally, if you look at the studies nationally, it's probably 10 to 15% of parents are in that high conflict range.
Is that where they just make up a third of our work? That's
well, that's exactly right. But because remember how many people are figuring out their own custody stuff without any input from outside professionals.
Right.
So you're right in that you're talking about of the ones who come to you, it may be a third, and a third. But nationally, it's that 10 to 15% who really use up a lot of time of the courts and of professionals like myself because they need that kind of input. They are just so caught up in the conflict and hostility of the divorce that they can't work through the custodial issues or the parenting issues very well.
And I see. So then when I try to explain to them, you have to foster the other side a relationship with the child. It's for some people, like we said, we talk about this lack of insight. It just goes right past them. They can't conceptualize that that's something they're supposed to worry about. And I always find it fascinating. And so that's what you can do differently. I can just sort of be amused by the fact that they don't seem to follow, and frustrated that they goof it up in between hearings and don't progress. And then when we come back, actually, after the next break, I want to talk to you a little bit more about, what we do with people after we've kind of decided how to do the custody situation, and talk about some co-parenting counseling and some of the tools that people can use to make things work. Because that's the more interesting question is, can we rehabilitate? And one of the questions I'm going to ask you a little later is, out of this 10 or 15% that we're talking about that are high conflict, realistically, what percentage or what cohort can we expect to ever resolve? Or do some of them just have to resolve when the kids turn 18?
Well, we can talk about that.
All right. 540-0580. I'm here with Dr. Arnold Shienvold. By the way, doctor, if somebody wanted to get hold of you in your practice to potentially hire you for a custody evaluation or for work in some kind of family therapy, child therapy, how would they contact you guys?
Well, our phone number here is 540-1313.
Okay.
We're at 2151 Linglestown Road in Harrisburg. They can call anytime during the week between 8 o'clock in the morning and 8 o'clock in the evening, except on Fridays it closes at 5, and there's always secretaries and receptionists available. And
we're gonna put a link up to your website on our weekendappointment.com, as well as on romingerlaw.com and on a Facebook. So if people want to find it that way, they can as well. 540-0580. See you guys after the break. Welcome back. Carl Rominger here. Got Dr. Shienvold on the line. He's talking to us about custody evaluations and how that works. If you're just joining us, we're now going to talk a little bit more about what we do to manage custody cases as they go forward. Doctor, was there anything else you wanted to tell me about the evaluation process that you thought people should know in particular?
Well, I guess the only thing I would add is that I mentioned it a little bit earlier. A custody evaluation, if viewed in a positive way, often it creates a huge amount of anxiety, and understandably so, because in essence, a parent is defending their abilities as a parent and often getting attacked from the other parent around those abilities, and it becomes kind of a negatively oriented event in that there are, some sort of allegations or concerns raised. On the other side of this, it really can be an educational event in which you have a professional who has a considerable amount of expertise in the area of parenting and what might or might not be best for children in certain contexts, offering up that advice for the parents to use or for the parents and their attorneys to use to facilitate really a flexible, dynamic parenting arrangement that really takes the children's needs into consideration in a much more individualized and unique way than they might get from the more blunt, cutting block of the court. So I think if one were to approach it more that way, it could be very, very helpful.
I've also seen in a few of the evaluations over the years where the evaluator is able to identify sufficiently individual issues with the parties, something that mom or dad might need to work on in their own what do I say, psychological or spiritual health, and gives them a roadmap to what they need to do so that they can get back into the custody game, so to speak. Oh,
that's very true. I mean, it's very common for me in a custody evaluation to make multiple recommendations around either individual therapy that a parent could use to better understand certain aspects of their own personalities and how it affects their ability to work with their child or with their ex-spouse, or recommendations around counseling or therapy for kids who may be experiencing really difficult adaptations to their parent's situation, and that's really forcing the parent into having to take more difficult stances with their child at a really tough time. I mean, remember, we're seeing people, especially early on in this, not somebody who's 3 years down the line, but early on in a separation where these issues come up, we may be seeing parents at their worst rather than at their best. They may be enmeshed in anger over betrayals or perceived betrayals or perceived wrongs. Their own sense of stability has been undermined, and their sense of security is being challenged as they look at financial threats and legal threats and vocational threats in this. So it's very important that anybody working in the process, and most especially a custody evaluator, be aware of that, because given some time and some ability to just self-heal and allow time to heal it, this person may look very, very different 6 months or a year down the road.
Well, we just got and it wasn't from your office, but in a case I'm involved in, we got a report that basically, said one of the parties should take a hiatus from custody for 6 months while they work on some personal issues, and if they're successful with that, come back to the mix. That's not my client; it's the other client. I imagine that person probably, feels like, well, why would I do that? But I think that's what they were trying to say is you're having these major life issues of your own that need fixed, and dealing with the child as an additional stressor. But at the same time, you're all the bad things that are happening to you are rubbing off on this child when they're in your custody.
It's really a very difficult situation and a very complex situation, because unfortunately the court works in the moment. And in a very static way. So mom's going to have primary and dad's going to have partial, and here's the arrangement. Dad's going to see the kids every other weekend and Tuesday and Thursday evenings till 8 o'clock and sometime in the summer and sometime over vacations, whatever it may be. And it stops there. I mean, that is the arrangement. There's nothing that can be done in that arrangement that says in 6 months, let's see how things are going and see if we can move this forward a little bit more, because dad may have had some parent education training. And so, for example, we know from research that dads actually become better dads after they separate than during the marriage.
Right.
Because the roles that each spouse played in the marriage were based on the roles of the entire family intact. So dad may have relied on mom as the gatekeeper or as the primary nurturer or whatever, and was not as involved in things as he's going to become when he has to act as a single parent.
Right.
And that's like across the board. We see that as generally true, even though there's a changing dynamic in families now. But let's take the traditional kind of gender distinction. So we know dad is likely to become a better parent and learn more about routines and schedules and gatekeeping and appointments and all those types of things. But the court can't fashion a custody arrangement that way.
Right.
And if the parents can't communicate well and don't have ongoing communication, and if there's ongoing conflict, they don't have the mechanisms to make the adjustments, the flexible adjustments down the road as different parenting styles evolve.
Interesting.
So it's always a very complex mix that you're thrown into.
And I know, and that's what I'm going to want to talk to you a little bit about next, which is the ongoing, some of the concepts of, for instance, a co-parent counselor or co-parenting coordinator. But we do have a few callers popping up, so let's take a few of those here. Bill, you're on with Carl and Dr. Shienvold.
You say Bill?
Yep.
Oh, yeah, this is me. Well, my wife, she currently is in a situation right now with her ex, and they're doing a parent coordinator thing. And right now he's trying to like get the parent coordinator off the case, and he does everything to try and manipulate everything. Back in a little while ago, the one daughter was living with him just for a couple of months, and then she was supposed to come back, and he held her and stuff for a long time that he wasn't supposed to. But what my question is, like, he continually, like today we get papers again, and he's contesting the parent coordinator. He contests everything. Is there any way to stop, like, having him keep doing this stuff, or it's consistent?
Do you want me to?
Well, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think the place to start, maybe for the listeners, is explain what a parenting coordinator is. Parenting coordination is a relatively new process that's entered the mix of alternative dispute resolution processes like mediation, introduced into the family courts. A parenting coordinator can be assigned to a case following the ordering of a decree, following a decree. So you get your custody order and custody plan, parenting plan out there, but there is so much conflict between the parents that they need someone who has the ability to facilitate communication between them and to make decisions in the event that they can't make those decisions. Now, the scope of the parenting coordinator's authority is often defined in the order that they get for that, but most definitely a parenting coordinator cannot change the basic underlying custody schedule. So if it's a shared custody schedule, the parenting coordinator can't make one of the parents primary and the other non-primary.
Right.
But what they can do is, let's say that mom's family is having a reunion on Sunday and it's dad's weekend. And dad is saying, I don't care if you're having a reunion or not, I'm not letting the kid go. Rather than running to court and trying to get emergency petition and all the expense and all the time involved with that, they can go to the parenting coordinator who's been assigned to them, say, here is the conflict. The parenting coordinator can try to get them to agree to something different, but if they won't, the parenting coordinator can make the decision, and it will serve as an order, unless challenged in court, as to what will happen. So it's a process that is supposed to make life easier for kids when their parents especially are having difficulty making decisions together. So that's what the parenting coordinator is.
Yeah.
So
I mean, it's similar to what's going on right now.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's working, actually, but...
Does he challenge the coordinator's determination a lot? Is that what's happening?
Well, he just did. Oh, yeah, he just did challenge it, and now he's, like, saying that she's pretty much incompetent and she's taking sides and all this stuff. And he got, I went out and got a lawyer for this.
Well, generally defined in the order is a way to grieve the parenting coordinator. And what the only way to grieve or try to get rid of a parenting coordinator is what he's apparently doing, which is go back to the judge and ask them to be removed. But that would have to be with some very apparent cause, and the causes that might cause a parenting coordinator to be removed are clear bias, or some other unethical behavior.
Yeah, I mean,
short of that, probably the best thing that can happen is short of that is you have a very supportive judge of the process, meaning parenting coordination process, and that judge says, no, I'm not going to remove. Now, the judge may also have the option of then saying, I'm going to assess all costs for this to the party who grieved unfairly.
Yeah.
And the key to parenting coordination working is, number one, having a good trained parenting coordinator, and number two, having a good, strong, supportive judge who basically says, you're in this process, stay with it.
And Bill, I got to let you go because we got to go to break here.
Okay.
So I guess the answer is hopefully it continues to work. And now if they keep dragging you back to court to test this, that's exactly what I would ask the judge to do. I'd say, Judge, you need to make it clear to the other side that they need to defer to this parenting coordinator and only make noise when it seems legitimate, otherwise face some sort of financial sanction.
Okay.
Okay?
All right, thank you.
All right, got to go to break here, guys. 540-0580. We're talking with Dr. Arnold T. Shienvold, Ph.D., on child custody issues. If you're just joining us, and Tina, when we get back, we'll let you ask your question. Welcome back. Carl Rominger here, usually answering your legal questions, but today we're joined by Dr. Arnold Shienvold out of Harrisburg area, practices with Riegler, Shienvold and Associates. They have a comprehensive psychological practice there, and he's answering questions for us. Tina, what do you want to ask the doctor? Tina.
Yes. I have a question. I had recently participated in a custody evaluation, and I was told and under the impression that it took 4 to 6 months. Ours took over a year, and cost a lot of money that I foot the bill for. And my question is, and when we received the evaluation, a lot of the information was not included in the evaluation report, and I just felt that it was kind of a waste of my time. We got nowhere, and we spent a lot of money on this. I also have a couple friends who have experienced the same thing. My question is this, are we in the minority, or is this something typical?
Well, I'll field that first. In my experience, I can only think of one time where I thought a report was somehow deficient. I can tell you that with Dr. Shienvold, at least, any report I've ever seen of his is very comprehensive, and it lists what was relied on. But generally speaking, if you had counsel and I'd been your lawyer, I would have said, okay, what is missing, what's wrong here, and let's see what we can do to feed this back to the doctor or the licensed social worker, whoever's produced this document, and see how they would respond to that. I mean, a year does seem like a long time to get your report.
I would say the typical length of time for a custody evaluation, a comprehensive custody evaluation, and so we go back to what I was saying, our process is earlier, is probably 3 to 4 months, maybe 5. And part of there's several reasons for that, or could be several reasons for that. When you're coordinating the schedules of all the people that I was talking about, that sometimes is problematic. So, for example, I might have a parent who tells me, well, I can only come in Mondays at 7 o'clock. So, therefore, my ability to see them becomes tremendously hampered. So scheduling problems can certainly arise. If there are important records that I need to see, you're at the whim of the people sending you those records, or you have to go back to the court and ask the court to order the records released, so that can slow it down. So there are a variety of issues that can slow it down. I would say part of the reason that at a minimum it takes 2 months goes back to something I said earlier, and that is that if you condense your evaluation to just a couple of days within a couple of weeks, you may get a person who's at a bad point in their life during those weeks and see a sample of their behavior which is not typical of them. And that can create a bias that you really don't want in the thing. Or on the reverse, you can get somebody who may be decompensating in some way, and they can hold it together for 1 or 2 days, but over the course of a couple of months, they're not able to do that. So that would be another legitimate reason for it to go out a little longer. I'll be honest with you, a reason that sometimes reports are delayed is one side isn't paying for it, and there's still money owed, and people don't write reports until the money has been paid in full. So the delays may mount, but a year is extraordinarily long. And I think the Pennsylvania legislature and the Pennsylvania courts have really tried to push to get cases resolved more quickly than that.
Okay.
The other problem you face with that long a report is you go into court and your data's a year old, and somebody says, "Did you know that Johnny now has been kicked out of school?" And so you have stale data.
Mm-hmm.
As far as not including stuff, at the very least, someone doing an evaluation should list everything they considered, okay, in the report. They may not then put any weight on it. So you might hand somebody a journal of all your entries since 2008, and they may say, "I had a journal from 2008, but I didn't put any weight on it because it was kind of just a one-sided report of what happened." So that's what I can think of in terms of your question.
Okay.
All right, Tina, thank you very much.
Thank you.
In all deference to Tina, you also sometimes never know when people say, well, they didn't do much or they didn't include the right stuff. Sometimes that means there was an adverse conclusion they weren't happy with.
That's very true.
And I find they keep believing that if only the doctor had listened to this or would look at that, they would change their evaluation.
Yeah, there's a big difference between listening and hearing and agreeing. So.
Well, and I have the pleasure of dating somebody who has advanced psychological training, so I know you guys can make observations very quickly when you talk to somebody, and put together a lot of information that isn't obvious to the untrained eye. I've learned to cross-examine people, so I think sometimes I get a hint when somebody's saying something to me that it isn't consistent with something that they told me before. It doesn't quite ring true.
Sure.
And that's a skill that I've learned in the courtroom. But I know from dealing with the psychologists like yourself, professionally and personally, that you guys have a very different sense of perception of people's demeanor and why they're doing what they're doing, or at least possible reasons why they're doing what they're doing. And you talked about, for instance, like decompensating and holding it together for a while. And we've seen that. I actually saw that in a custody case not too long ago where the person held it together for almost the entire hearing, but not the entire hearing.
Right, and that can happen. That's very, very true. I mean, the other thing that happens is not an issue with the custody evaluation, but I can get a custody evaluation in 3 months, but then they don't go to court for a year after that.
Right.
So then your data is stale, but not because you didn't get the report out in time, but because there were continuances and delays in the court proceeding.
There's a theory out there called case management, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. But I think if the lawyer's doing it right and the court's doing it right, you get these situations where sometimes the court says, we won't schedule a hearing until we have a report.
Right.
And you want to say, Judge, can you hold with me a little longer? Or you're done for the hour?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I can stay a little bit longer.
Yeah, hold over to the second hour here, because I really think people want to hear this. We're getting a lot of feedback. Even though we're not getting a ton of calls, we're getting a lot of feedback.
Okay.
All right, hold on.